Okay, so this is Henry again, and this is the third example. This is the vessel that I made in class based on a sine wave that I then randomized. So I start out with a parameter for the overall height. Overall height, let's call it. And I hook that up to a slider. Say it can go from a minimum of 1 to, I don't know, 36. It could be really tall if we want. And once again, we'll start out with an origin point that we're going to bake in as kind of 0, 0, 0 using this component here, not literally bake. Parameter, we'll call that the origin. Now, there are lots of ways to do what I'm about to do, but for the sake of pedagogy, the way I made a bunch of points that are the points in space where we're going to create our circles. And here under sets, what I want is I want a range. And a range will take a domain of numbers and a certain number of steps, and it will spit out a sequence of numbers. So what a domain is a domain is just a list of two numbers, a start number and an end number. And if you look under math, here are all the components about that relate to domains. So we're going to construct a domain, and we want the first number in that domain to be 0, because that's going to be, our point on the origin. And I'm going to use a panel because that's always going to be 0. And we want the second number in the domain to be the overall height. And we'll use that to feed our range here. And then we also want a number of sections. We'll make that a parameter. Let's call it num sections. And hook that up to a slider. And maybe that can go from a minimum of 1 to a maximum of, 100, and we want to make sure they're always integers. So sometimes I double up my parameters like this, because that way, when I want to organize my definition, I can pull things far apart. I can keep all of my parameters with sliders together, but then all the way over here, I still know what my inputs are. Right. Now, just like when you divide up a curve, when you divide up a range, right? If I mouse over a number of sections, let's say I want an even 30, right? It divides up that range into 30 pieces, so you actually get 31 numbers. So I'm going to use the trick where I just say put x minus 1 in the expression editor for the n, and then I get out 30 values. And let's call it, and these are basically our section heights. So if I take my origin point and I move it, and instead of giving it one vector to move it, I give it, and I'll get it over here to unit z, and I'll take my list of numbers and make a list of vectors, and I'll give my move a list of numbers. And if you zoom way in, and again, let me just change my preview colors. Let's forget to do that ahead of time. You'd think I would learn. Right? So I can say my overall height is maybe 7 or whatever, 7.2. This is my number of sections. So it's, right, and those are essentially just a whole bunch of points in space. Right, all stacked up. Let's call this section points. So what I want to do is I want to create my vessel by making a series of circles that I loft together. So under curve and under primitive, there is a component which will draw a circle based on a plane and a radius. So I want to make, at all these points, a new plane that's parallel to x, y. So here under plane, you get an xy plane. Now if I turn off the preview on all this stuff here, right, maybe I'll keep the points on. Right, you can see that now I have all my circles. Let's call this circle sections, and I could loft them. Right, I get a pretty boring shape. So what I want to do is I want to vary the radius of those circles. And I'm going to vary the radius of those circles instead of using a parameter or a system of proportions. I'm going to use a sine function. So what I'm going to do, actually I'm going to use, let's see, here under trigonometry, I'm going to use cosine, because here's my range of values, and I can see my range of values. Since the first one is 0, I don't want it to come to a point. You'll see what I mean in a second. So I'm going to take my section heights, and I'm going to use them as the input to my cosine. But I might need to sort of scale them up or down. So I'm going to create a parameter called wave scalar, and go back to math and multiply. And I'm going to multiply my heights by my scalar, and I'm going to say maybe that scalar can vary from 0 to 3. And I'll use that as the input to the cosine. Dump it to a parameter called radius. So that's going to be the radius that I'm going to use. Now if I hook it up to the panel, you can see my output. Right, my output seems to vary around 0 to 1. Or it even goes to negative numbers, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. So what I might want to do is I might want to scale that up as well. So I'm going to create another parameter, and I'm going to call it radius scalar, and I'm going to give it also a slider, and say that can go from 0, I don't know, up to 24. And here I'll multiply the output of my cosine times my radius scalar. I'll use that as my radius. So I want that over here. You'll see when I plug that in, let's look at it in front view. Right now, the radius of the circle is being controlled by this function. And if I up my scalar, right, you can see that it gets fatter and thinner. And if I change my wave scaler here, you can see that what that does is that it changes the period of the sine curve, or in this case, a cosine curve. So if I'd done a sine curve, right, because that value is 0, you would see what would happen. Where is it? Trig sine. Right? It starts out at a point. That's why I decided to go with the cosine. You can also see, interestingly, over here, right, if I change my number of sections, right, it just sort of makes the resolution better. But if I change my overall height, because of the way my parameter system is set up, it continues to draw. Right? And you can see that gets a little wonky because I don't have quite enough sections to make it a smooth curve. There you go, it's a little bit better. And I could also decide that I want a sort of minimum value for my radius. So let's add that as a parameter. I didn't do that in class, but let's do it here. Let's call this min radius, because right now the radius goes to 0. Let's set that up with a slider. I'm just going to kind of cheat and copy that slider. And then I'm going to go back to math, and I'm going to add the output of my scaled cosine to my min radius. So that means that now, no matter what, when this function drops to 0, you know, my minimum radius will never be less than, 2 or something if I change that slider. Right. So now if we look at this lofted form here in a perspective window, that's kind of cool. And I'll make a surface parameter. And we're going to call it, I don't know, we'll call it sine vessel. Bake it. So the other thing I did to make it a little bit more fun was I added a little bit of randomness so that the sections don't quite align. So I have all of these circular sections here. I'm just going to sort of select everything and turn its preview off. And what I did was I decided I would get a random number here under utility, I think is where it is. Actually, again, this is the one I couldn't find. So I'm just going to double click and type random. And I get the little terrier in a box. Great. So this asks for another domain, which is going to be the range of the random numbers and the number of random values. So the number of random values we know we want is equal to the number of sections. And the range, that actually could be a parameter. So I called it the minimum X shake and the maximum X shake. And I set it up with a slider. So let's say it goes from 0 to 5. And if you remember what I did under math to create a domain was construct domain. So now if I set that up, if you mouse over, I'm creating a domain from 0.25 to 1.35. And if I plug that into my random with my num sections, right, and I plug that into a panel, you can see I'm getting a list of 88 values that all fall between 0.25 and 1.35. Now I'm going to copy this whole thing. Copy, paste, Control-C, Control-V. And I'm going to rename this to be the minimum Y shake and the maximum Y shake. And if I get another panel, as long as my sliders are the same, you see I got a problem, is it's producing the same stream of random numbers. And that's because computers actually aren't very good at producing random numbers. So what we need to change is the seed. So if you give it a different seed, and let's create a parameter called seed, and let's say it's going to be, I don't know, 4. And then let's say that for down here, the seed that we're always going to use is the seed parameter plus, I don't know, that number. Right, so now here the seed is 4, here the seed is, 2,349, and you can see that the numbers, the list of numbers is now different, which is good. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this list of random numbers to make a random list of x vectors, and this list of random numbers to make a random list of y vectors. So here we have 88 y vectors with a random magnitude, 88 x vectors with a random magnitude, and now we're going to add them together, and that produces our new composite vector, and we can make a vector parameter, and we can say that is the shape vector. So if we go over here, right, and we take our circle sections, and we get a move component, we take our 88 circle sections and our 88 shape vectors, right? If you look in a plan view, you can see that if I set these to 0, and that to 0, it's now not shaking in x, but it's only shaking in y. Now, one thing that I could do is you can notice it's always shaking in one direction. Is I could do two things. I could take my slider and allow it to have negative values. Right? I could say this goes from -5 to 5, and then allow my slider to go negative. Or what I did in class was I did a multiplication when I created my domain. This is how I did it before, is I just said, this is the x shake. And I'm going to multiply it by 0.5, or, yep, 0.5. Oops. Undo. 0.5 times my x shake, that's going to be the high value. And -0.5 times my x shake, that's going to be my negative value. And then if I look at what the domain is, right, if I set this up to be like 2, right, it's going from -1 to 1. Or 2.8, -1.4 to 1.4. So now it's shaking the same in the x and the y, the back and forth. Right, and I could do the same thing actually with my y shake. So let's maybe just erase that, and I'll select these. And use that to create my randomized domain. Call this now y shake. Right, so if I set the y shake way up, it's going back and forth a lot. And if my X shake is down, it's not going side to side very much. And so now that I've used my shake vectors to create my, shake up my circle sections, maybe create a new component we'll call circle sections shaken. If I go through and just select everything here and turn off the preview, and I use that to feed my loft, and then I bake it. You can see what's happening now, right, is I'm getting a kind of shook up vessel. And one thing I could do, right, if I decided that the seed, that should be a parameter too, right, if I change that number, now I haven't changed any of the parameters, I'm just changing the seed that it uses to create a random value, or any of the parameters that control the shape. I mean, I'm just changing the seed parameter. And if I bake that, right, you can see that these have the same height, they have the same periodicity of the sine wave. They just have they even have the same maximum and minimum shake. They just have a different type of shake, a different set of random numbers. You know, or if I go here and I change my wave scalar, right, and make that higher, it's going to give me sort of more waves. Right. And I could bake that as well. Maybe give it a little more X shake. Right. So that's how I created the kind of shaken up wave tutorial. Of course, if I, again, you know, if we set that down to 0 and set the Y shake down to 0, you can see that we're back to our plain old smooth version. And that's how I did it.